Hey everybody, today is Monday, June 6th, 2022. Coming up on the show today, from Top Gun Maverick, editor Eddie Hamilton.
27 cameras running on one day, and there was 23 hours of dailies the next day, and I remember thinking, I can't do this on my own anymore, I'm going to fail. Some of these timelines would be kind of 18 or 19 hours long for a sequence that was going to be 40 seconds in the film. We were watching it through with Tom, and we all just looked at each other and he said, guys, this isn't good enough, is it? We all kind of knew it. The sequence still needed more work editorially, and I've been editing that scene for over a year.
Yes, all that and so much more in this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, here we go. I thought this day would never get here. I'm sure anyone involved with the movie Top Gun thought this day would never get here. Delay after delay after delay, but we are here. And we have so much to talk about today, and what a guy to talk with. The one and only Eddie Hamilton. If action editing had a name, you know the rest. Now stop me if you've heard this before, because I think I said this or something like it in the intro to the Mission Impossible Fallout podcast I did with Eddie. And no, I'm not going to go back and listen myself to find out, because if I did say what I'm about to say before, I'd have to come up with a new intro, and I don't have time for that right now. But the gist of it is this. Before I ever met Eddie Hamilton, I didn't like Eddie Hamilton. I know, right? How can you decide you don't like someone before you've ever even met them? Awful. They have a word for that. Prejudice. Which means I judiced him pre to ever knowing him, or something like that. I don't know. I didn't take French in high school. The reason for my ridiculous, unfounded opinion about him was that, well, since we talk about movies around here, I'll use that as an analogy. Have you ever had a bunch of friends, and a bunch is more than I actually have, but a bunch of friends that go see a movie that you haven't, and they won't stop talking about what an amazing movie it is, like Top Gun Maverick, and ask you why you haven't seen it, and yes, go see Top Gun Maverick. And then after a while, you get sick of hearing about it and almost hoping it's not as good as they say, just so you can go back at them and question their ability to identify greatness. Maybe I'm revealing too much about myself here. But that was what happened with Eddie. He had done a presentation for Avid, one in which I was not involved. And this presentation was apparently so amazing that all I kept hearing about from everyone was how fantastic and energetic and insightful this guy was about editing and filmmaking and storytelling. Disgusting. But I could not avoid this growing legend forever. No. And the year was, I believe, 2011, somewhere around there. And fate pointed its fickle finger at me and said, you must join Eddie Hamilton for an Avid presentation at the National Association of Broadcasters Convention in Las Vegas. Challenge accepted. At last, I could finally snort in the faces of all those devout Hamiltonians and say, this guy was what you thought was so amazing? But that moment of glorious comeuppance never come-upped, because they were right. Eddie was as advertised. He dazzled the audience, and yours truly, with his remarkable speed and agility in moving from the technical wizardry to explaining how to create action and tension and how to tame the most ornery of timelines. All wrapped up in an unbridled enthusiasm for his craft and an honest admiration for his fellow editors. And I knew that day there are going to be a lot of fun times ahead with this Eddie Hamilton kid. And today is one of them, and it's awesome that you can be here for it. You already know all about Top Gun, and if you're a diehard editing geek, you probably know a thing or two about Eddie. So I will forgo any background info in that regard and get things moving so we can hear from him, especially after my extended little preamble there. Thank you for indulging me. But please indulge me a little longer while I tell you about two awesome companies you do need to know more about. Now let me ask you, when you're sending files over the cloud amongst your production teams, do you feel the need? Wait for it, for speed. Of course you do. But you also need security and cost flexibility. And that is why you need Massive. Massive, spelled M-A-S-V, is a file sharing solution for anyone who needs to collaborate remotely over the cloud without limits and with maximum security. Massive provides a secure file transfer solution that can move terabytes of data over the cloud, even when other cloud-based solutions put a cap on what you can send. Not only that, they are a member of the Trusted Partner Network's roster of vendors. So you can fly casual knowing that Massive is a proven service that not only protects you against data breaches, but also integrates with your favorite cloud storage providers like OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropbox, Frame.io, Backblaze, Iconic, and others. You don't got to sign up for any subscriptions, you just pay as you go at 25 cents per gigabyte. And if you sign up for Massive today using massive.io/the-rough-cut, you can get 100 gigabytes free towards your first transfer. Once again, that's massive.io/the-rough-cut for 100 gigabytes free. Someone else you want in your crew is Extreme Music. For over 20 years, they have been providing amazing production audio to content creators throughout the world of media and entertainment. Yes, music created by the top names in music production and composing. Names like Trent Reznor, Michael Giacchino, Quincy Jones, Snoop Dogg, and so many more. All you got to do is visit their website, extrememusic.com, and search on just about every aspect of music you can think of to find the tracks that you need. You can even give them a track and say, hey, Extreme Music, find me something like this. And you know what? They'll do it. Not only that, their impressive catalog of tunes is customizable right down to the instrumentation so that you get the sound that you want in a way that suits your story best. There's no cost to just give it a try, and as far as the licensing goes, you can take care of all that stuff online, or they can have one of their reps help guide you through it. So, for your next media making mission, be sure to visit extrememusic.com. Okay, at last, our pal Eddie Hamilton is back. Let's head on up to the flight deck and join Eddie for a little talk about a big movie, Top Gun Maverick.
Having to kind of explain anything, like the audience has eaten their broccoli by the time you get to the third act, so there is just a brownie to eat rather than have broccoli in your brownie, that's the thing. But that Chris McQuarrie is he's the genius behind this. He is the guy who understands that instinctively. The amount of exposition that you're giving the audience through the movie in all the training sequences, and the training sequences are an intricate tapestry of precise jet choreography, lines of dialogue, cutaways to the tack room with the mini little model jets on the screen, all of which everything is designed meticulously so that your eye is guided around the screen and everything that you're hearing is in sync with everything that you're seeing, and it's effortless to watch. You're learning all this information about G's and speed and angles of attack and laser sightings and all this stuff, but you're being presented to it in a very entertaining way. But, when Maverick does the canyon run and he says 2:15, you're like, the audience is going, wow, that is impossible, 2:15. Like, they've learned enough about the parameters of the mission. And then, like, you've eaten all your broccoli so that by the time that the third act comes, it is effectively like one of these Mission Impossible heist sequences where all the stakes and you can just see the mission happen, and then shit starts to go wrong, and then you're left to confront that, but you don't have to have anything explained to you. But you're absolutely right.
I think it was May 2019, 3 years ago. Last time I saw you in person, you did a presentation on Mission Impossible Fallout at the same time that you were cutting Top Gun.
Oh, yes, in Burbank.
That's right.
That's it. You're right. Yeah. Wow.
There's going to be a lot of dusting off the cobwebs in this discussion.
Yeah.
Because I think Top Gun might hold the record for pandemic-induced delays.
Yeah, probably.
So you're going to have to do your best to recollect this film.
Yeah.
Let's try and put some parameters around the production and post-production timeline of Top Gun.
We started in August 2018. I remember because I flew to LA with my family at the beginning of August 2018, or middle of August 2018, maybe. Joe Kosinski and Claudio Miranda had filmed for about 5 days on an aircraft carrier in July. So when I arrived, the first thing I had was 12 hours of dailies, 15 hours of dailies of aircraft carrier activity. And that was the kind of opening sequence of the movie, which is a montage of cool stuff happening on an aircraft carrier, which is very reminiscent of the first movie. So I did that in August 2018, and we filmed for about a year on and off. There were some hiatuses for prep, and basically they filmed most of the ground story, and then we went and we did months of filming for the aerial sequences, starting inside the cockpit and then outside the cockpit. And then we did some pickups for the ground story. We finished, I'm going to say, about a year later, and roughly a year later. And then I went back to London, and then there was another year of post in London, and we finished the sound mix at the end of July 2020. So almost exactly 2 years. And when lockdown happened, we had done 2 very early test screenings. So I did see the film with an audience twice. But we didn't have the score finished. We didn't have the sound mix finished. We didn't have all the ADR done. We didn't have pickups done. So the film that we screened, which went down really well, but we knew there was still a lot of improvement there. So I had seen it with a crowd, but then when we obviously went into lockdown, everyone was working from home, et cetera, and everything was done on Evercast. I was on Evercast all day. So a lot of the kind of fine tuning of the edit was done on my laptop in lockdown, and then going in late at night with VFX reviews on Evercast. And so I'd never actually seen the film with a crowd of people until Cannes, which was last week, where we had our kind of European premiere. We didn't compromise on the quality of the end result, though. You know, the lockdown did give us an opportunity in the way that a lot of films had. We were about to roll cameras on Mission 7, and actually I was in a hotel room in Venice. We were working on the Top Gun edit with Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie, and then the lockdown happened and we had to sort of stop. But it did mean that everyone's focus then reverted back to Top Gun because we couldn't roll cameras on Mission. So it actually gave us an opportunity to really stress test every single frame of the movie and really look at every sequence and every emotion and every dramatic beat and every note of the score and really make sure that everyone thought it was as good as it could be. And I'm sure that extra time has resulted in a better movie.
I don't know what it looked like before, but it certainly looks good now. And I think you find yourself in a very unique situation. If you go back to 2015, you're working on Mission Impossible Rogue Nation.
Yeah.
And then with the exception of the work you did on Kingsman: The Golden Circle in 2017, you've been completely immersed in this world of Tom Cruise and Chris and doing stuff for Paramount. Same studio, lots of the same people. Did you literally have the flexibility from a technical standpoint to work on both Top Gun and Mission Impossible at the same time?
Yeah. I'm kind of doing that right now because right now I'm working on Mission Impossible 7 and Mission Impossible 8 at the same time. Just a colossal amount of media. I've got two 96 terabyte drives, one for each movie. And then for Top Gun, we ended up with two 20 terabytes and a 96 terabyte drive so that I could have everything online at once. But yes, that's basically what I was doing. And it's surprising how much of the movie was edited on a MacBook Pro laptop. It's astonishing because I was traveling around so much to different locations, to naval bases, to hotel rooms, to working at home. And then obviously, once lockdown eased a bit, I would quite often go to Chris McQuarrie's apartment. Sometimes we would even screen the movie for Tom where he lives and then have editorial sessions there. Yeah, it's astonishing, really, that I could edit Top Gun on my laptop. But that is what we ended up doing, just by necessity, I guess.
It doesn't surprise me at all because I recall you editing on a laptop in a car on the way to work doing Mission Impossible Fallout.
That's true. That is true. I still do that, actually. I still look at dailies in the car on the way to the studio or on the way to work if there's a lot of it, you know.
It seems like there's always a lot of it.
Yeah.
Before we get too far away from the concept of working on location and on set, it seems that editors kind of run 50-50 on liking to be on location so they can have a better understanding of what's going on. And then there are others that say, no, I don't want to be anywhere near it because I don't want to know what went into that shot. I don't want to know the labor, the time, the cost, all that stuff. I want to be able to make my editorial decisions free from those kind of thoughts.
I don't really like being on set because I don't like falling behind. And I find it's quite inefficient personally for me if I'm around a set because you don't get left alone really enough to get through the day's work. So I much prefer to kind of go to a cutting room and shut the door and, you know, focus on what I need to get through that day. With Top Gun Maverick, it was different because Tom Cruise rightly said, Eddie, I need you to be on the base with us. I need you to be in every briefing and I need you to listen to what we're trying to get with every flight, so that when the footage arrives back, you know what you're looking for and you're understanding what we've been trying to achieve in the air. And he was right. And it was essential, really, for me to get my head around these aerial sequences and how they evolved during the briefings and then in rehearsals in a wooden mock-up of an F-18 on the ground before the pilots went up. And then once they landed, we would grab a card from the camera and watch the footage kind of live with about 20 people in a briefing room. And we would start to feel what was working and what needed improving from the first day. And I ended up going to 6 different naval bases around the kind of west coast of the US over a period of 6 months or something. I mean, it was a very, very massive, epic adventure to try and capture all these tiny little pieces of story in all these different geographic environments so that you didn't feel like the action was all happening in the same place all the time, you know? And interestingly, on Mission Impossible now, Some days I'm on set. They've got a little editing trailer on near set, shall I say. And some days I go and I kind of help with Splinter Unit. But quite often they send me a live video feed from the set so that I can kind of keep an eye on what they're doing as I'm working during the day. And then if Chris McQuarrie has a question for me, he can phone me up and actually go, hey, can you just take a look at the screen? Tell me what you think. And I'll do that. And then I can feed back. And also I get a sense of how things are evolving on the set during the day. And I'm actually finding that quite useful in some ways. And I've just literally 2 weeks ago came back from South Africa, where we were there for 3 months filming a very ambitious sequence for Mission 8. Or as you now know, it's called Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 2. But yes, another extraordinary sequence, which is, again, truly historic in terms of cinematic historical impact and what we've achieved. There were some days where the crew were just looking at each other, amazed that we had a ringside seat to what we were seeing Tom do. And it was 3 months of daily extraordinary achievements. And again, I was there so that I could be aware of what they were doing and listen to all the discussions that were being had and stay on top of the footage. There is so much of it that it's actually hard to cut the sequence while you're doing it. What I tend to end up doing is I start to kind of break down the footage into like tiny story beats so that I have everything kind of stacked up for each bit of the sequence. But in terms of cutting it, I'm actually getting to do that now. So I'm trying to kind of work on these shots that we're doing for Mission 7 now. And then in the kind of second half of the day, when I've taken care of the Mission 7 stuff, I like start to dial in this action sequence for Mission 8. But it's mostly single camera on the main unit at the moment. So it's a manageable amount of footage. But on Top Gun, I was totally overwhelmed with footage after the aerial sequences.
800 hours, I read.
Oh, yeah, 813 hours. I'll send you a little graphic from the lab of a breakdown of all the footage. That was quite overwhelming at times. And you kind of lose sight of where you are in such complicated sequences. But the real trick is just to kind of keep going and keep putting shots on the timeline and keep working your way through the sequence, regardless of how good or bad your shot selections are. But even that was just massively, massively time consuming. I mean, weeks and weeks, months of work for just one aerial sequence. The third act, I think, took me, the last kind of half an hour of Top Gun Maverick took me about 3 months to do the first pass, which was really long and really rough. But that was the kind of amount of time that it took. And it was small amounts of time every day that I would build onto the timeline. Seconds, sometimes just seconds a day, because there was so many choices for every moment. And again, I'm so thorough. I'm desperate to make sure that only the very, very best footage actually gets into the movie. So I'm always asking myself, is there a better bit? Is there a better bit? Have I been thorough enough here? Because I really like to be thorough and like to know that I'm not taking any shortcuts. I'm a fan of these movies, right? You know that, Matt. And so I love Top Gun. I saw it 6 times in the theater when I was 14 years old when it came out. And I know that most of the audience thinks that making a sequel to Top Gun is a terrible idea. And if I wasn't involved in it, I would probably think it's a terrible idea, because I would be like, why are you trying to do this? It's perfect. What are you doing? But when I was offered the chance to do it, and I had talked to Joe Kosinski and Jerry Bruckheimer, and I heard what Tom wants to do, I said to myself, no, this is going to be a real adventure and a once in a lifetime opportunity to be part of something this ambitious. But I did feel the weight of expectation every day, and I was putting it on myself, but I was also imagining the millions of people, sitting there with their arms crossed saying, don't screw this up when they're going to see the movie. And I desperately didn't want to disappoint them every day. I really felt that and didn't want to let people down, let the fans down. But we just kind of kept going and trusted the process and kept refining it. And then luckily, the reaction seems to be very positive, which I'm just so gratified for. And it's just such a relief to me and to everyone who worked on it,
Somebody else who thought it was probably going to be a bad idea to do it was Tom Cruise. He rejected the notion of doing it for a long time. And I read that what sort of turned the tide was Joe Kosinski and Jerry Bruckheimer bringing this lookbook to Tom and showing him.
Yeah.
Were you able to see this now legendary lookbook?
That's a good question. I don't think I saw anything that Tom was shown. I think Joe went to see Tom when we were filming the Mission Impossible Fallout motorbike chase in Paris. And one of the ideas he pitched was this idea of Goose's son being in the movie and that being the core emotional relationship in the film. And Tom could see the potential of that and how we could build that conflict into a movie and resolve it right at the end of the film, and how that would be immensely satisfying if we got it right. And it was really hard to get right. It took a lot of trial and error and iterations and scenes that we filmed that just didn't quite work and all that stuff. But that kind of core idea was, I think, what helped Tom sign up, but also the idea of doing it in F-18s for real. Because, of course, in Top Gun, very little of the pilot close-ups are done for real. There's a handful of them. If you go back and watch, you can tell that a handful of them are done in F-14s, but most of them are done with rear projection, and Tony Scott can move the camera around the cockpit. And we didn't have that luxury, really. All our cameras are kind of bolted down. So the visual energy of the aerial sequences is actually quite different to what they managed to do in Top Gun. But we have this 100% reality, which makes it very unique.
Now that promotion is really in full force for Top Gun Maverick, one of the things that's coming out is how Tom Cruise designed a unique boot camp for the actors, where they went through this 3 months of training. That makes me wonder what you did to prep. You know, once you read the script, talked to Joe and Chris, and you know that this is going to be a big project, what do you do to prep for it, both personally and from a editorial setup standpoint?
Wow, that is a gigantic question, Matt.
It's a big movie.
Yeah. The script that I read. So here's the story. I was at a test screening for Mission Impossible Fallout in April 2018-ish. Yeah, something like that. And I got a call saying that, could I have a chat with Joe Kosinski about doing Top Gun? And obviously I was thrilled because I love Top Gun. But I said, look, I'm actually just in Arizona. Instead of calling him tomorrow, why don't I get on a plane to Santa Monica and then I'll just go and meet him in person? It's always and I can, it's way better to meet people in person. So I literally booked a flight, and I asked Paramount to schedule my return London flight back from LA that afternoon rather than from Arizona. So I flew in at 7 in the morning, and I went to Jerry Bruckheimer's office, and I was given the script to read, which evolved a lot during production. And there were some core ideas that were the same, but there were whole sequences that were just completely changed. But I met Joe, and I remember him saying, we're here to help Tom make his movie. And, he showed me some of the concept art, and we really hit it off. And he hadn't seen Fallout at that point, but he had seen Rogue Nation. And I think Tom was keen to kind of carry on the creative collaboration of how I had kind of worked with him on Rogue Nation and Fallout. And I went to meet Jerry Bruckheimer, and I thought it would be a very brief kind of handshake and a hello, but he sat down and talked with me for an hour about filmmaking and editing and post-production. And obviously I've seen all his movies many times. And it was a privilege to sit down with Jerry and start to kind of get to know him a bit. And I would chat with him a lot, obviously, over the following 2 years, because he really takes a lot of time to kind of visit the editing room and review scenes and be very involved in the productions of his movies. But the hitch was I had to move to LA for a year. And I remember talking to my wife and saying, this opportunity to work on Top Gun has come up, but I don't know if it's the right thing for our children to leave London. But actually, my wife, Charlotte, convinced me that traveling to LA for a year and moving the kids to a school in Venice Beach would be a great thing for them to have that experience. So ultimately, it was down to her, because I knew that she would have to do a lot of the heavy lifting of taking our kids to school and making sure they felt cared for and supported in this kind of slight change of scenery that they would be, going through for this year of their lives. And I would be working insanely hard because I would be away sometimes because I'd be on naval bases. But we rented a house in Mar Vista, and I was able to cycle for 15 minutes each day to Jerry Bruckheimer's production office, which is where we set up our cutting rooms. But I didn't have any assistants over there. That is the one thing which was quite unusual. I couldn't really bring anyone from London. So I had to find a whole new editorial team out there. But it's fun to do that. It's a pleasure to do that. And I take a lot of pride in meeting potential assistants and really talking to them in detail about what they want and where they are in their lives and what's going on at home and what they want professionally. And I explained to them what I expect of them and how we're all going to work as a team and how we're going to support each other. So I managed to find a kind of core group of assistants who I assembled, and I managed to meet them all in person as well. Like, I did go back to LA once before I flew out to have a kind of meeting with them all, so I could look them in the eye and they could meet me and we could make sure that we were going to collaborate well as a team. And they hadn't really even met each other because I was kind of recruiting them through kind of word of mouth. And there was a first assistant that I found called Matt Sweat, who was amazing. And then there was another editor I found called Laura Creasy. She came on as an assistant, but also as kind of an associate editor because she had some editorial experience from Bad Robot. And I knew that there's going to be times where I was going to be asking someone to kind of help me throw scenes together because I'd be working so hard. And there was a second assistant I found called Travis Canty. Then my trainee was Emily Rail Russell, who was just coming off, I think, Godzilla versus Kong, I think. But that had been her first film as a PA. And then this is her first movie as a trainee. And then a visual effects editor called Latham Robertson. So those were the kind of core team that I found. And we worked really well together for a year. Well, it was 2 years, but I was there for a year and then I was in London for a year and they were kind of minding the shop back in LA while I was working pretty much with Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie on the movie over in London. And then obviously during lockdown, I was in London and they were all working from home in LA. So the other things I was doing for prep is, first thing I did was I asked Paramount for a high quality version of the original movie and all the 5.1 stems. They had done a digital remaster of Top Gun, I think in the year 2000. So I was able to access all the surround stems from that. So one of the first things I got my team to do is break down the effects stem so that I had a library of different jet sounds and stuff that we could use, which would all get replaced ultimately. But the sound design in the original Top Gun is astonishingly good. What CC Hall did with her team on that film is mind-blowingly complicated, especially when you think they did it on 35mm mag, using relatively primitive tools compared to what we have now. And the sound is still amazing when you listen to it today. So I built up a library of jet sound effects and we got the kind of original score from Top Gun loaded in. And that was kind of it in terms of prep. And then, I was off on my LA adventure, which was, the most extraordinary year, really.
Eddie's LA Adventure would make for a pretty great movie, too. Well, I'm glad you digressed because I think not nearly enough we talk about the sacrifices that filmmakers, editors have to make and their families have to make as part of this job. So I'm glad you were able to sort of illuminate that a little bit for people listening so they know what goes into committing to something like this.
Yeah.
I often, perhaps too often, ask editors who are working on sequels or reboots of movies if they go back and study the original film. But in this particular case, an additional editor on Top Gun Maverick is Chris Lebenzon,
yes,
who cut the original Top Gun along with Billy Weber.
Yes.
So love to know about what you talked about with Chris,
yes,
about his experience on the original film and his approach to things like dogfights and other recollections and just what Chris contributed to the film Top Gun Maverick.
Yes. Chris Lebenzon came on to the movie. He was a gentleman. He's an amazing editor. He's worked many times with Tony Scott, obviously, and Tim Burton, and worked on some incredible films. But one thing which happened before Chris came on is that there was a time during the aerial photography where I was so overwhelmed with footage. There was one day in March 2019 where they had 27 cameras running on one day, and there was 23 hours of dailies the next day. And I remember thinking, I can't do this on my own anymore. I'm going to fail. And professionally, I'm not going to be able to do my job. I can't really keep up to camera and I can't watch all this and I'm going to fail and I need help. So I remember saying to Jerry Bruckheimer, we should bring someone else on to help because I'm really going to struggle on my own here. And he said, absolutely, let's do it. No problem. Tommy Harper was one of the producers. He immediately leapt into action. And Stephen Mirioni came on to join us. And I will be forever grateful to Stephen because he obviously is, one of the best editors around as well.
No question.
No question. And he's so kind and so talented and gracious. I said to Stephen, look, I'm buried in aerial footage. I'm really struggling. I've got an assembly of the movie. Please just start at the beginning and recut anything however you want. I'm not precious about anything, honestly. Just you use your own spidey sense and you tell me what you think. And just, I'm not attached to any of it. I just want it to be amazing. It's like, whatever the best idea is, let's get it in there. And Stephen came on and worked for several months. So while I was doing 3 months working on an aerial sequence for the third act, Stephen, and I said to Joe, look, I'm happy to show you what I'm doing once a week, but I'm doing 10 seconds a day sometimes. It's like it's very small amounts of progress on this aerial sequence. So you can come and watch 1 minute or 2 minutes a week, pop in on a Friday, but the rest of the time I just need to work through it. So Joe Kaczynski would sit and work with Stephen in another cutting room down the corridor from me, and they kind of work their way through from the beginning of the movie. And then when Stephen had to move on to another job, then Chris Levinson came on. Now, Stephen really contributed in some very significant ways. And one of the biggest contributions, finding the tone of this movie was very difficult, and focusing each sequence so that the emotional clarity was clear and not muddy was very difficult, as it is on every movie. But the key to this film was, the movie's called Top Gun Maverick. Effectively, it's a single protagonist movie because subjectively you're following the film through the character of Maverick, through Tom Cruise's point of view. So the audience has to feel that emotionally there is a pyramid as they're watching the film. Now, this is something that they should just sense subconsciously rather than be spoon-fed, right? But that principle kind of guided how we cut the movie, which is Maverick's at the top of the pyramid, and then Rooster is below Maverick, and then it's kind of Hangman and Phoenix, and then it's Payback and Fanboy and Bob, and well, Phoenix and Bob are together, I suppose, and Coyote, and then there's Penny in there. But the most important thing is that Maverick's at the top of the pyramid. And when you're looking at tons and tons of coverage for a scene, it's very hard to kind of see the clarity, the simplicity of that sometimes. And it did take a while to discover that in some of the sequences, or to find. So, for example, the sequence in the bar where we first meet all the characters in the bar, we went back and did some pickups in there because we weren't subjectively with Maverick enough. And we went back and shot and did these angles where we were kind of pivoting around Mav as the characters would walk in. And then we did some better introduction angles with kind of lower cameras to give characters power. One of the hardest sequences in the film to figure out was at the end of the second act and the beginning of the third act. The very end of the second act is where the pilots are getting briefed on the aircraft carrier by Warlock, the character Warlock. And Stephen found a way to intercut the briefing and the best shots of the briefing with Maverick inspecting his F-18 and activity on the flight deck. So it has a kind of dreamlike quality, which is so effective, and a sense of inevitability and dread, and these pilots kind of feeling the seriousness of this mission, and that some of them may not make it, and feeling the pressure that Rooster is putting on himself because of the conflict that he's been through the movie. And then when Rooster and Hangman talk on the tarmac, and then Maverick talks to his friend Hondo, and then Maverick sees the other pilots as the canopies close, all that stuff, that was really, really difficult to get right and to find the tone. And Stephen worked on that for a very long time and came out with pretty much what you see in the movie now. He also found a great piece of temp score. We don't cut with temp score very often, actually, but that was essential for us to kind of start to feel how the dream state of that sequence would play out. So he nailed it. And I remember seeing all the footage, and I'd done like a rough assembly of all of it, but I knew it didn't work. But I didn't have the bandwidth to kind of roll up your creative editorial sleeves and go, right, we've got like these 4 or 5 scenes. None of them really work as scripted. But one of the common solutions is to figure out a way of intercutting stuff. And so it feels totally deliberate. By the time you watch the movie, the emotion just flows and it's consistent. But it wasn't for a long time. But Stephen figured that out, and I'm very grateful to him for that. Anyway, then Chris Levinson came on and again worked with Joe. I was in London for a bit working with And actually, we had almost a 24-hour cutting room because I would be on London time zone. And then Joe and Chris Levinson would work in LA. So we would be sending bins back and forth for a bit. And then Chris had another job to go on to. And then for the kind of the last, I don't know, 6 months or something of post, I was there. But the thing is, we had the movie. And at that point, we were really fine tuning it. And the brain trust of Tom Cruise, Joe Kosinski, Chris McQuarrie, and Jerry Bruckheimer, we really dialed in every shot of the movie. We just wanted it to be a slam dunk. Failure was not an option on this movie. It had to be spectacular. And we all wanted it to be spectacular, but my point is the quality control threshold was so high throughout this process. But, I share that sentiment. So it wasn't a problem. It was just a lot of very hard work. We didn't compromise in the music and the sound mix at all, for example. Everything was done right. The visual effects were amazing and all the ADR we wanted, we got. But the sound mix on this film, for example, we were the first back at the sound mixing stage after lockdown. So it was very strict protocols and only a limited number of people on the stage. And the sound mixer that we used, Mark Taylor, he's a genius sound effects mixer. He had done No Time to Die. That had been the film he did before the lockdown started. That was the previous film he did. They mixed No Time to Die in 3 weeks, 3 long weeks, but they did it. And Top Gun took 7 weeks. So it took more than twice as long to mix the sound because it's so complicated. Also, we didn't do any overtime because the studio were very strict about the hours we were working in order to keep us all healthy. COVID protocols were very, very strict like that. But we did not compromise. I mean, sonically, every single thing that you hear and see is exactly what the filmmakers wanted you to see and hear from the beginning to the end. Not a single compromise. Every second of that sound mix was scrutinized to make sure it was as good as it could be. And Tom Cruise would come in every week and listen to what we'd been doing and give us very, very detailed notes on how we could improve it. So everything was done to his satisfaction ultimately.
Well, if you can remember, I'm definitely curious to know what kind of notes, or if you remember a specific note from Tom about that sound mix.
Yeah, I mean, it's always emotional notes from Tom. It's always, I don't feel this, or this, I'm not feeling this enough. There were some sequences that really took a long time. For example, the very first dogfight, which we call the BFM, the basic flight maneuvers, we'd got a version of that sequence and we were using a piece of music, which is not the piece of music that's in the film now. And in the last week of the final mix, we were watching it through with Tom and we all just looked at each other and he said, guys, this isn't good enough, is it? We all kind of knew it, the sequence still needed more work editorially. And I'd been editing that scene for over a year. I'm not exaggerating. The first assembly I did of that scene was probably, I'm going to guess, it was very long. It was probably like 15 minutes or something.
Wow.
And then I got it down to 12 minutes and then I got it down to 8 minutes. And in the movie now, it's the scene where we use the Who track, which is 4 minutes, 10 seconds now. I think on the stage, it was 5.5 minutes. So in the last week of the final mix, we still took another 1.5 minutes out of that scene. We had actually tried to use the Who about 8 months earlier, but because the sequence was so much longer, the track didn't work. But I had just crunched it and 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 crunched it because it always reminded me of that montage at the beginning of Days of Thunder, the Gimme Some Lovin' montage when Tom Cruise is blasting around the different racetracks and building his relationship with Robert Duvall. And this scene, it had to kind of fizz and pop and be exciting and be snappy and dynamic. And there couldn't be a dull shot. And so you just keep pushing the edit. And eventually the shots that aren't as good just eventually kind of pop out of the timeline because there's no room for them. And every shot is kind of squeezed as close as it can be. And it's this tapestry of dialogue and music and sound effects to really just kind of get you to lean in and be thoroughly entertained. And then it's the story of the push-ups and the rhythm of Maverick shooting down the other pilots. And, it just took so long. And anyway, we recut it and then we did an edit of the Who song and we put it back up. And then Tom went, okay, now this is working. But it almost took we all kind of knew it wasn't right, but we were in the last week of the final mix and we were thinking, this is okay. This works, doesn't it? But it just didn't. We all knew it didn't. So that was one of the things that he, in his uncompromising quest for kind of perfection and like just great filmmaking without a single moment where you're kind of slightly embarrassed by the movie, when you watch it. And it went from one sequence where we were all like, to one of the sequences that we're most happy with, ironically. But I remember we had 3 days left of the mix, and I went and we recut the scene. We worked on it for maybe 3 hours, and I was just like feverishly kind of restructuring little pieces and squeezing it and getting it to work. Then our music editor, Cecile Tornasac, did an edit of The Who, and we got there. And then the next day we were on the stage, and then we made a few more tweaks, and then we went back, and we literally, it was the last thing we finished. But then the other note that he gave us, which was fascinating, in the intimate scene with Mav and Penny in bed, there's some very important moments for Maverick's character in that scene. He admits some, quite fundamental failings. And he said, guys, you should turn the dialogue down in this scene. And normally the note from most people, most producers especially, is the dialogue's not clear enough, it's not loud enough. And usually they're right, by the way, because we've all lived with the film for just weeks and weeks. But when somebody with fresh ears comes in, and if they don't understand a piece of dialogue, you have to fix it because it is the most important thing to get right. But he said, I think what you should do is we should take a look at the scene with the dialogue a few dB lower, because it's going to just feel more intimate, and the audience is going to sort of sit forward a little bit because they're going to have to listen. And I think you'll feel the scene more. And he was absolutely right. We went back and we remixed the scene with that note. And then when we watched it through the next day, when we watched that whole reel through, that 20-minute chunk of the movie, he was absolutely right. It was more emotional. And for Tom, everything is about giving the audience an emotional experience throughout the entire movie. And, his notes are always heartfelt, and they always improve the film. But they're never necessarily specific. It's more kind of general feeling. And it's the same on Mission Impossible when I work with Chris McQuarrie. The notes that he gives are emotional notes, and then it's up to us to figure out how to address them or how to kind of course correct slightly to get it where he wants to be.
Cutting the aerial sequences, sometimes you're doing 10 seconds a day, and you're dealing with 27 cameras.
Yeah.
What are the steps to that? Animatics, storyboards? Do they do any kind of previs for you to sort of work through this? Because again, it's all real.
I had some preparation because I had done the helicopter chase in Fallout. That was 80 hours of footage for a kind of 9-minute sequence. Okay. So I had some sense of how much heavy lifting it would be to break down the footage and just slowly build up the sequence. But that was one 9-minute sequence. And Top Gun has, a third of the running time is aerial sequences, right? So around 50 minutes. So it's a lot. And Joe Kosinski did prepare meticulously. Like he storyboarded as much as he could. And we did cut the storyboards into a kind of rough story reel and got the guys in the cutting room to record all the voices. And we started to build it. But really, it was just to have something to slug in to the edit as we were building the ground story around the aerial sequences, because they filmed everything on the ground first. And when the footage started coming in, the most important thing that you can do is try and be on top of it on a daily basis. I would sometimes take out, like, that is a great moment that will probably be somewhere in the film somewhere. And I would start to build like an assembly of pieces of action that were cool or shots that I knew were great. But I would break it all down. It's a very time-consuming process. Of the very first time I went to a naval base, I think I went on my own because I thought I could handle it. And then no, I'm going to need an assistant editor there with me. And then later I was like, no, I'm going to need 2 assistant editors with me, because we discovered that the sooner we could get the footage, the DIT would transcode it, and we would all work off laptops and mini local hard drives just with the raw footage we'd just been given. And the guys would start breaking it down by lines and then what the actors were doing. So when they moved their head left or right, or when they looked up, so that we had a kind of library of head movements. Because they're wearing masks, we can put any lines we want. And that's the one thing that you have to understand about these aerial sequences is we changed every line of dialogue dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times in order to get the exact right rhythm of story and the right pace and the right intonation and the right urgency. And as the sequences evolved and tightened and got restructured, the lines changed many, many times. So I would break everything down meticulously. So in the Avid timeline, I would have bins, scene bins, usual scene bins, but then I would also have bins based on the sequence that we were working on. And Laura was amazing at this. She would do these gigantic action strings, taking a 5-second piece of the story and giving me all the options back to back for everything. Sometimes I would go, I've started to build this, can you complete it? But they were very, very, very thorough about doing a completely thorough job. Some of these timelines would be kind of 18 or 19 hours long for a sequence that was going to be 40 seconds in the film. Or a minute or 2 minutes, and we would use subcaps to kind of label everything, which I know you've seen me do before, but it meant that I could load this gigantic timeline and kind of skim down and then find the piece. And then we would have 6-way split screens because there were 6 cameras rolling in the cockpit. So we would drop picture-in-picture effects and stack everything up on the timeline so that I could always see all 6 cameras. The main thing is we use the time in our day to break down the footage rather than try and cut the footage, I think is the moral of that story. And the logging of it, we did not take any shortcuts. So it meant that I could always go back and skim down and find other pieces of action. Now, that was for the interior shots, right? So that's not exterior shots of jets. That's just everything that the pilots are doing inside the plane. And then months later, we went back with a unit which was just going to do exterior shots of the planes. And again, Joe did storyboard. They did previs. And when I was editing the very early iterations of the aerial sequences, I'd go through all the different versions of the previs that had ever existed. And I would see if there was a shot that did something that we needed to do to kind of do this bit of story. Sometimes there would be, and sometimes there wasn't. Sometimes the previous team were downstairs. So I would sometimes say, can I have a shot of a jet doing this? But then we would go to naval bases and they would have ground cameras and they would have L-39s with cameras on. They would mount cameras to jets and we would go away and film that. And again, that resulted in just a lot of footage. 99.9% of it is not good enough to be in the movie. So you're looking for the kind of 0.1% of the footage, which is a jet turning left for 6 frames or 18 frames or whatever, to get the exact composition. And you'll see in the movie, the compositions are messy and dirty. And, because it's very long lens and handheld, like the first movie, it's actually hard to keep the jets in shot, but you get this incredible energy sometimes. So to build the aerial sequences, it was just a case of logging everything meticulously, taking your time to be really thorough, not feel under pressure to turn it around quickly, because you cannot do a good job if you're under time pressure when there is that much footage to go through. And then once I had an assembly, we would then look at it and it would always be 3 times too long. And we would start slowly condensing it down and lifting pieces out. One thing actually, which we did at the naval bases, is we had these jets on sticks and we would film on an iPhone some of the action of what the jets would be doing. And then I will also have that stuff to kind of cut in as an indication. And also so that when the pilots were going up to do stuff, they could see our little stick models and they would know that the 2 planes would be in this orientation and they'd be banking left and then they'd be doing a split S maneuver down that way and all that stuff. That was actually something else that we did. So most of the aerial sequences we kind of planned out with these stick jets as well. And those edits do exist somewhere, but they were just kind of visual tools really to avoid ambiguity when we were discussing what we needed to do.
You made a point about how Tom's notes are largely focused on the emotional. For these aerial combat scenes, is he concerned about technical accuracy and how believable some of the things you're showing are?
No, he is purely concerned in, am I engaged with the relationship between the characters on screen at any one time? Also, am I confused by the action? Geography and story is king. So he's very focused on, am I invested? That's actually all the audience cares about, when they're watching a film is, am I invested in the characters? Am I invested in the central relationships? Do I care about what's going to happen next? What emotion are you putting the audience through? And he just wants to dial that in. He is a stickler for accuracy in terms of the heads up display, he wanted to be really right. So that is a lot more improved over the first movie. And I think it is a lot more accurate to what the F-18 pilots see. And he would spot very small details sometimes, like, there was one shot where when I'd recut that aerial sequence we talked about, I'd taken one of the heads up display shots and moved it a bit earlier, and therefore the altitude reading was about 200 feet out. And he spotted that. And it just required me to change a 2 to a 4 on the hundreds, I think. But he spotted that and he said, "We got to fix that." And I said, "Yeah, you're right." And the VFX team went away and did it. But so he can be very specific, but most of the notes are very emotional. And it's always just, am I engaged? Do I care? How am I feeling about these characters? He just loves movies. He's just another audience member, and he wants to give the audience a great experience. That's always what he's focused on.
Well, you kind of just answered in part my next question. With so much of it being realistic, where is a lot of the energy going in terms of visual effects?
So obviously the Dark Star sequence relies heavily on visual effects because he's not really going Mark 10. And that kind of sequence is what Joe does so brilliantly. A lot of that previs, actually, that was previs, and a lot of that previs just became the shots. So there was a lot of that. And then in the air, mostly what it was is where we needed to add a jet. So if we're on a pilot and we need to feel a jet in a certain proximity behind them in the distance, sometimes we would take an element of a plane and put it in there because it's very dangerous for jets to fly very close together. So there's a couple of shots, obviously, where Maverick flies between two planes or something, which would be too dangerous. So what they would do is they would film the two planes and the planes would split, and then we would film the element of Mav's jet going through the middle separately, and we would combine it together, that kind of thing, where it would be too dangerous to be doing that. And then the whole section at the end where the surface-to-air missiles launch and the jets are having to launch the flares, launching countermeasures, all that stuff. Smoke in the air, all that stuff. There was visual effects used to kind of generate the flares and to generate the surface-to-air missiles flying towards the planes, which, we couldn't obviously do that for real. And that sequence, actually, I wanted to make sure that I gave Chris Levinson a lot of credit for, because, listen, a lot of these scenes are made entirely in the edit, but that moment where the SAMs start firing and the jets they're all talking to each other and going, "Rooster, Sam on your 6 and Sam on your nose," and all that, that's completely made in the edit based on what we had and the shots of the jets that we had. And I did a first pass at that, which was incredibly rough. And then Chris took it and worked on it with Joe for a while and came up with a lot of the ideas of how the pilots were talking to each other and that Maverick's tipping them off and they're all, all that stuff. So I would love to give him a lot of credit for moving the needle significantly on that scene, because it was very long and not that exciting when I had done a first pass at it, and he really dialed it in. And the other place where Chris really helped actually was the scene on the ground with the helicopter where Maverick's in the snow. That, again, when we filmed it, was quite different, and we just needed to evolve significantly in the edit, basically. And again, it was one of those where I didn't have time, and I said, "Chris, would you take a look at this?" And he spent a long time working with Joe, getting that scene just right. And then the other thing that he did, which was so helpful, is part of the very final dogfight, when the two planes dive into the canyon. I don't want to do spoilers, so I won't say who it is, but originally the planes were the other way around. So someone was being chased instead of someone was, anyway, Tom Cruise said, look, this isn't working because Maverick needs to be being chased into that dogfight. And originally he was chasing the enemy plane. And so we had to take that short section and throw it all out and look at the dailies and rebuild it so that it looked like Maverick was in front, which he was not in any of the footage. So it was quite hard to do that. And that was one thing where, again, as an editor, you get that note and you are excited to do it because it's a pure editing challenge. You're taking footage that was filmed for one purpose and you're retooling it to tell a totally different story, literally the opposite story that you were trying to tell, you're now telling. So again, I just didn't have time. I was buried somewhere else in the movie, and Chris said, I'll take a look at that. And he spent a week pulling it all to pieces and rebuilding it and came up with a new structure, which was very effective and so helpful. But also, just to go back to the VFX, Matt, the enemy, the 5th gen fighters are L-39 planes or F-18 planes that have been skinned to look like the Sukhoi 57s, the Su-57s. So those are Chinese and Russian planes, which we didn't have access to. And so the visual effects team took the L-39s and the F-18s and reskinned them to look like the enemy 5th gen fighter. So when I was editing with like another F-18 or another L-39 in the shot. And actually, some of those were the very first shots we turned over, because obviously that has to look real. Otherwise, you'd check out of the movie straight away.
To experience this film, it's amazing to hear you talk about doing so much of it on a laptop.
Yeah.
Because the only way to really experience this film is in the theater. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. IMAX,
Yes.
there are the ScreenX.
ScreenX, yes. ScreenX is an ultra-wide format where the walls of the theater show the movie as well. So the ScreenX conversion is excellent. I can highly recommend it. There may not be one in Boston, but there is one in London. There's several in LA. There's one in Koreatown. There's 2 in London, actually. But they converted 53 minutes of the movie, which is the most of any film they've ever done. And it took the most time of any conversion they've ever done. Because we had these other cameras in the cockpit, they were able to use all that extra footage and put it on the walls of the cinema. So it's super wide as opposed to the IMAX, which is kind of taller. But it's essentially the same sections that we converted to IMAX almost is what we converted into ScreenX as well. It's about 53 minutes of the movie.
Does a presentation like that affect you at all as the editor? Is there anything you have to do or consider when you're delivering a film in that way?
No, that's a good question. So they do not touch the master 239 DCP of the movie. They just generate content for the wings, the sides of the movie theater, and it fades up and down throughout the film. So in IMAX, you have the sailing scene is in IMAX, whereas in ScreenX, we did not do the sailing scene, but everything else where the aspect ratio changes for IMAX, we did ScreenX as well. And the only thing we do is watch it back. So my assistant, Matt Sweat, he spent months going through the aerial sequences, delivering additional footage for every shot in the sequences, in each aerial sequence, so that they had raw material to build. It's an astonishing process, and they do it brilliantly. Until you see it with your own eyes, you won't believe how good the conversion is. The whole sequence, for example, where Maverick does the low-level canyon run, they've done an amazing job with that. It is astonishing how they've brought the whole cinema just like swings around. It's the most incredible thing to see. If you want to experience the movie in that format, I highly recommend it. The sound is only 7.1 in those theaters, so it's not Atmos. So for me, Dolby Cinema is the best presentation you'll get, because it's going to be bright laser projection with Dolby Atmos. But no, all I do with ScreenX is that Joe and I watch the conversion at the end and give them notes if there's things we feel can be improved. And when I saw it, I only had about 8 notes on the whole movie. So they did a brilliant job.
It seems like every film that you do, you come into it having learned a new method or tool set from your previous project that you want to apply to the current one. Anything new you learned on Fallout that you brought to Top Gun, and subsequently anything you're taking from Top Gun into the Dead Reckoning films?
Good question. On Fallout, it was the first movie that I had done that was at 2160p, ultra high definition resolution, which doesn't necessarily affect how you cut the movie at all. It's more about the resolution of the image that you're looking at, and also the ability to project it on a very large screen straight off the Avid timeline if you want to. Also, you can see the visual effects at Ultra HD resolution as they're coming in. So you're not just waiting to see the finished visual effects at 4K in a screening room at ILM or wherever you're going, DNEG or wherever. So you're actually keeping an eye on the quality of the visual effects at a very high resolution throughout. And Joe Kosinski was all for it, which was great. So for Top Gun, all the visual effects were done at 4K, which was the first movie where I've done where all of them were at 4K. And on Fallout, we only had the IMAX sections at 4K. The rest were 2K. So on Top Gun, everything was done at 4K. So the movie, the Ultra HD version of the movie, or the 4K version of the movie, is true 4K from beginning to end. There's no upscaling, no up conversion. And so that's one of the reasons why the movie does look sensational in the theater. So on Dead Reckoning, I did the same thing where I said to the visual effects producer, I said, look, on Top Gun, we did all our visual effects at 4K. And I know on Fallout, we weren't able to do that. But could you ask ILM if we can do everything at 4K? And she did ask, and they said yes. And I feel like if you're watching a 2K up-res and being sold it as 4K, it's a bit of a shame. It feels like you're cheating a little bit. Whereas if you can guarantee that you're working at 4K all the way through. Now, none of this necessarily affects the editing experience or the emotional experience, because a lot of people will see the film on a TV or whatever. And so really that kind of ultra high resolution won't really affect their consumption of the film. But there are people who want to buy a 4K disc, or they want to go and watch the movie at 4K, and they are getting the true full 4K experience. And as a nerd, I care about that stuff. I'm trying to think if there's any kind of workflow things. Like I am using the new media composer, which I didn't use it on Top Gun because we started in 2018 before it was released. But on Dead Reckoning, I'm using it and I love it. It's way better on a laptop. It's a lot easier to use on a laptop. I love how I can tab things and have multiple uses for the different windows so that it's very, very efficient on a kind of small screen real estate of a laptop. There are so many amazing new features that we use. Like, I have to say, Edit Group, oh my word, if we didn't have that on Dead Reckoning, there's this sequence that we filmed in South Africa, so complex in terms of multiple cameras attached to things and cameras kind of being stopped and started in the air and on the ground and throughout the day. So the fact that we had Edit Group was a lifesaver on a daily basis. And, those kinds of things which maybe assistants use and the editors don't necessarily, but I want to make my life as easy as possible for my assistants, and I want them to have all this new functionality, so I'm all for it. But that was the one thing I would say using the new media composer. And I know I'm on an Avid podcast, so I am going to say that, but I genuinely do believe it. And it took me a while to kind of get my head around how to use it. But, after kind of a week or 2 weeks fiddling and playing around, and the only limitation is you have to have somewhere on the interface, you have to have either a clean vertical line through the screen or a clean horizontal line through the screen. But once you've kind of got past that, which I always used to have my screen oriented a slightly different way, that's the only compromise I had to make. And now I just absolutely love it.
It's amazing to think that a film that you started 4 years ago, that it's finally here and the reviews are just over the top. So congratulations on what was an amazing 4-year journey.
Yeah. I mean, it was 2 years of really intense, detailed, hard work, pouring love into every frame of the movie and making sure it was as good as it could be, and desperately not wanting to disappoint audiences and fans of the original Top Gun. And then 2 years of waiting for the right time for audiences around the world to see it. And I'm so excited that people can now get out there and return to the danger zone and just have an amazing, amazing night out at the movies, which is, as editors, all we want to give to people. I remember when I was young, going to see movies at the theater and almost having a spiritual experience. There's maybe 20 occasions where I've been in a cinema in my life where I've just sat at the end and had to take a real long time to kind of leave the emotional highs that I was on and just find my way down back to real life. I remember thinking, if I could ever be a part of something as powerful as that, because someone has done this to me, a filmmaker has had this incredible emotional effect on me. And that's what I want to do with my life. That's what I want to contribute to. I would love to give that to a teenager or a youngster or even just a movie fan. And when they watch the film, they just feel that people really care about the movie that they're watching. And if the movie turns out well and everyone loves it, I'm so thrilled. I'm so relieved. I'm so excited. So thank you for your kind words, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Nobody's going to be disappointed, but I will be disappointed if after all your time on Top Gun, they didn't give you a call sign. Do you have a call sign?
I did get a call sign. My call sign is Trigger.
Love it.
Yeah.
Well, if you happen to talk to Tom anytime soon, could you ask him to come up with one for me?
Yes.
I don't care how dangerous the mission. Eddie Hamilton, I would be your wingman anytime. Let's everyone give Eddie a big rough cut salute for taking a break from his work on Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning so that he could talk with us about Top Gun Maverick. Hopefully we didn't get him in any trouble with Tom Cruise. And yes, I promise you that when that film comes out, I will badger Eddie into joining us once again and telling us about whatever new tricks he has up his sleeves. Maybe that should be my call sign, Badger. Hey, if you would like to be a Top Gun in the editing room like Lieutenant Hamilton, a great way to do that would be to fly Avid Media Composer like Eddie does. It's not nearly as hard as learning to fly an F-18, but once you spend a little time in it, you'll be editing at Mach speed. So check out the link in the show notes for all the latest on Avid's flagship nonlinear editing system. All right, my friends, our adventure today has come to an end. I hope you enjoyed it. I always do. Until our next one, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.